Hello and happy Wednesday, everyone. I am going to be doing some short videos. I think I'm going to try this out and see how it goes every week to go along with our Revelation series, touching on some important things, and then I hope sparking conversation with some of you through our online communications, especially through our YouTube channel, so that we can have some more study together for those of you who want it on the book of Revelation. So I'm just going to touch on a few things. First of all, if you have not heard the sermon from Sunday, I will be pointing you back to that for a lot of introductory and overview work, things that I think will help us as we move through the book. That's available on our website, tidelands.church. It's also, you can find it on podcasts, on Apple Podcasts. So just a couple of things I'm going to touch on that we talked about a little bit on Sunday, just as an overview, and then I'm going to add a few more things for you today. The first thing is that when we talked and when I introduced Revelation, I said that this is an apocalypse. That's the word that's used in Greek. It's a type of literature. This word means to reveal, thus Revelation, to unveil, to uncover. It's also a genre of literature that was around during the time this was written in the 2nd century AD. So this type of literature has some characteristics to it that's pretty interesting. There's often a lot of beasts involved that represent kings and empires and people. There's historical events that get depicted as natural phenomena like earthquakes and floods. And colors and numbers have meanings. We saw the number 7 already in the first chapter. But it's not just apocalyptic literature, it's also prophecy. Now, as we connect this book into biblical prophecy, we need to be reminded that prophecy is not primarily about prediction or about predicting the future. Prophecy is primarily a word that God's people need to hear now, today, and it's in light of the promise of the future. God's not in the business of prediction. God's in the business of promise, because you're not predicting something if you're controlling something and you're sure of something that's going to happen. So this is prophecy. So when we get into Revelation, we do have a tendency to be thinking about the future a lot and what this might mean about the signs of the times and things to come. And that's okay. There's some of that there for sure. But we need to hold in mind that this is a prophetic word, both for the churches and the Christians who read it when John first wrote it, and also for us today. Okay, it's also a letter. And we know it's a letter because it is written to the 7 churches. We're going to be looking at that the next 2 Sundays. And this letter then means we are reading someone else's mail. And it's important for us to know and remember what they were going through so that we can then be encouraged and know what it might mean for us as a church today. So one of the things I mentioned is that Domitian is the emperor. And one of the things that's going on more intensely at the time this letter was written, around 92 to 96, is that there is a demand being made by the emperor that he is now Lord and God, that he will be called and worshipped as Lord and God, Dominus et Deus. He changes the name of the Roman Empire to the Eternal Empire. He calls himself the Everlasting King. And all citizens are supposed to go to a temple built in his honor, take a little pinch of incense, throw it on the fire, and say that Caesar is Lord. Now, I've reminded us many times one of the earliest Christian creeds we have in Scripture is that Jesus is Lord. So you can see why this little act of worship would be a big problem for Christians like John. That's probably the reason why he's on this prison island of Patmos, where he's most likely working in the rock quarries that they have there. Okay, so that's the things we touched on from Sunday. And I do want to add a few things extra here. One of those is that a couple of resources that I'd really encourage you to consider if you want to dig in more deeply. One book is in the series, the Bible for Everyone by N.T. Wright. He has some of these for every book of the Bible, and he has one on Revelation for everyone. You can get that in digital form or printed form. Very accessible. You don't need to be, steeped in theology, or it's not written towards academics or even pastors. It's, as it implies, for everyone. Good stuff. I encourage you to check that out. N.T. Wright's work on Revelation for everyone. Second one I have here in printed form, and this is by Eugene Peterson, one of my favorite pastors and authors, and it's called Reversed Thunder, and it's his earliest work on Revelation. And in there, he brings up a few things about John, who wrote this. John, he's been called different things: John the theologian, John the seer, and others. But the evangelist, John the evangelist, who wrote this book, Eugene Peterson points out that he writes it from three different perspectives that we need to keep in mind if we're to interpret it and understand it well. One is that he's writing it as a pastor. So this ties into that idea that it was a letter written to the churches, right? John is concerned and cares about the people that he is writing to in the churches that he's caring for. And so this is a pastoral letter in that sense, although we don't normally classify it as such. He's also writing it as a theologian. Now, I think we tend to think of theologians as being sort of those distant academics who are in their ivory towers, who are writing these big, long books. And sometimes they are. But the best theologians, Peterson argues, and I agree with them, are the ones who write in the stuff of life while they're living it. And John is doing this. He's writing as one who is currently suffering for his faith, and is writing in light of these sufferings of the reality of who God is and what that means practically. So that kind of a theologian. The third one that Peterson brings up, and I love this, is that John is also writing as a poet. And again, this ties into the idea of the apocalyptic genre, right? John is using words in a way that's not just conveying information, but it's bringing up pictures and realms and realities. And so in that sense, I love how Eugene Peterson says, and I'm quoting here, when we read poetry, we do not have more information after we read a poem, we have more experience. And he says, Eugene Peterson argues that one of the biggest mistakes people make, and that leads to misinterpretation and misunderstanding of Revelation, is not seeing it as poetry and seeing the poetry in there, the beauty of the images and what John is doing there and what God is doing through John in that. So there you go. Just some more introductory stuff. In chapter 1, we see this big exalted image of Christ, and it's a lot different than what we were used to. And so I talk about this in our sermon. But this is what I'm going to leave us with on this Wednesday in between our sermons, between chapter 1 and chapter 2. The image of Jesus as the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, the exalted King and priest, the one who has control of all things in his hands, holding the stars in the midst of the churches. This Jesus is the central important figure of Revelation. If we sit with that, if we're reminded of that reality and that truth, then we will do well as we seek to interpret it and understand the book. So that's my encouragement for you on this Wednesday. Please, if you have any thoughts, questions, anything at all, engage in the dialogue in the comments below this on YouTube. This will probably go out in some other formats, so if you want to use those as well, that'd be great. But I'm going to try and see if we can get some folks engaging on YouTube, and I'll try to follow up with anything you might ask or comment there.